Rather than thinking of the ways in which destruction has been distributed and in which the stability and sustainability of the West has been secured by generating volatility and vulnerability elsewhere, post-apocalyptic culture renders this geopolitical plane into a moral and cinematic question, either by being confronted by impending disaster or suffering from a fall into mere survival. What is depicted as humanity sloughs off its less than human past and allows its properly human form to emerge. A self-enslaved humanity, shackled by its lesser tendencies, casts off what it has actually been in order to emerge as the incarnation of its proper and always virtual potential.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, a pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, I just want to mention we do have a Patreon account, patreon.com/MUHH. Consider dropping us $1 a month there, or maybe leave us a nice review. To introduce our guest today, actually our newest patron, so thank you in advance there, but Taylor and I are going to bring you today Claire Colebrook, Edwin Erle Sparks Professor of English, Philosophy, and Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Penn State University. Claire's the author of over a dozen books spanning a broad range of disciplines and topics. Her most recent publication, Who Would You Kill to Save the World, is the work we're going to be looking at today. It'll be forthcoming from the University of Nebraska Press. Again, thanks for both joining us on the show and being our newest patron. We're thrilled to have you and excited for this talk.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we ask about your origin story, because to me you are a superhero, as I said, I just got Coop into Deleuze probably in the past couple of years, right? Maybe
I think you're misattributing your own influence. My own interest in Deleuze predates our relationship. Yes.
All right.
Absolutely.
All right. How about Aguatari pilled you then? Is that
a
fair?
little bit? Yes.
A little bit. Okay. Obviously we always try to start, and Coop, you segued better than I did, so I apologize. We always try to start with understanding where our guests are coming from. And to me, you are a superhero, so I want to know your origin story as much as Coop does. Just tell us a little bit about what got you into, whether it be philosophy, writing, Deleuze, if you can remember, or a moment in time that sedimented or solidified that possibility.
It actually came from when I dropped out of school. I was trying to be a musician and I wasn't very talented and became disheartened and dropped out and was working as a cleaner, childcare person for some Labor politicians in Melbourne. And they were having Peter Singer over for dinner.
Oh my God. Peter Singer. Okay.
Peter Singer. And I was asked to cook something vegetarian. And I was one of those people that were, like, would you like some carrots? Or are you worried that they screamed when you took them from the ground type person? I was a ideological meat eater. This is like pre-internet, pre-YouTube. And I looked into Peter Singer, and I'd never read a word of philosophy in my life, right?
Okay.
But he had this argument for vegetarianism, right? Which is utilitarian, which is, do you get as much pleasure from eating a fillet steak that it would warrant taking another life? I think what seduced me was less Peter Singer and utilitarianism than just an argument, right? I'd never really heard an argument from principle. I'd heard things like it's cruel or affective reactions. And this family that I was working for, they were Labor politicians of a really good type. They had copies of a Marxist journal on their bookshelves called Thesis 11, which was pretty much sort of semi-Frankfurt School inspired. And they used to say, look, read this on the train. You can read any of our books on the train on the way home.
Oh,
They weren't
okay.
indoctrinating me at all. Like I could read any of their books. And so I decided to go back to university and study philosophy, and was immediately disillusioned because, of course, it was analytic. But there was one zealot there who did Husserl, right? A real zealot. And so I got completely seduced by, again, I think it was more the style of the argument. If he'd been a zealous Wittgensteinian, that would have been where I'd have gone, right? It was more that
Right.
I encountered someone who was a real thinker. Didn't publish much, I have to say, but those are often the best people, right? I went over to the English department at the time when there was that, like, the theory explosion.
I knew you had an English, maybe
Yeah.
comp lit background. We could
Right.
just tell. We mentioned the Milton, but this is
Yes.
before we recording the Milton book, the Blake book.
Right. Yeah, I did my PhD on Milton.
Oh my God. Well,
And I was a strong Heideggerian. And then I got my first job at Murdoch University, and I met Ian Buchanan, who I don't know if any of you have met Ian. It's like, Claire, we should do a Deleuze conference. I'm not interested in Deleuze. Claire, we should do which bit of the conference? Ian, I'm not interested in Deleuze. So you can do this bit of the Ian, I don't want to do that. And we should edit a volume on Ian, I don't want to. So I got dragged kicking and screaming into Deleuze studies by
and
Ian.
you're grateful, I assume.
I am grateful. Yes.
So you are a recovering Heideggerian, and
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've only talked to Ian, like you, on, what do you call it? The messaging app, because I don't really go on Facebook.
Oh, right.
Except
yeah, where Ian and I are the Facebook generation, right? Like, we're just that bit older than you.
I go on
Post pictures of our pets on Facebook and stuff like that.
You're right. It's instead of pets, it's my sister. I have one sibling, my sister. She has two nieces. I don't have any children. So I go on Facebook to see, she's a very proud parent. I go on Facebook to see pictures of my nieces.
And maybe that's why it's called
it's
Facebook, right? It comes from yearbooks and just keeping in touch with people from your past. Technically, that's its origin, and that's still.
I mean, for me, it's always been people in my future, because people like you and Ian are not people I've met, besides the fact that I can say, hey, I'm kind of in the Deleuze sphere. I've translated some Guattari, some Simondon, but that's an amazing story, especially the fact that you came in as a Heideggerian. I would have never known that, and unless you
hardcore Heideggerian.
Hardcore Heideggerian.
So that when I published the book on Milton, which was written in like
2008. I mean, it's published in 2008, but you said that was
I'd written it, maybe like it was my PhD from 1990.
You're right.
And so everything that I saw in Milton, which was the fall from an original Adamic language into
okay.
That's like, all I had to do was put a minus sign in front of everything I thought in 1993, and I ended up with Deleuze.
I've had people ask me about Deleuze's relation to Heidegger, right? Because you see in like Difference of Repetition where there's almost, what I was told, and I look back in the French and figure this out, was like the Heidegger stuff is actually footnotes, but in English it's incorporated into the main body of the text, right? Where it feels like maybe Hippolyte or Alquier or one of his advisors was like, hey, you should incorporate some Heidegger, and Deleuze is like, fine. I
don't think that's right. I think he's deeply Heideggerian in two respects.
Okay.
One, we're supposed to be thinking beings, yet no one's actually thinking. He has a different answer, right?
Yes.
But Deleuze is not, as like some really not smart readings have of him, like a simple anti-humanist, like we're all just like the plants and the no, humans have this capacity to think, right? It's
Mhm.
just that they actually don't do it most of the
Right,
time, right?
right,
So
right.
that's problem number one, and then it becomes like the political problem of anti-Oedipus.
Yeah.
Why are human beings so consistently not actualizing their force, their power, right? So that's the one
Mhm.
respect in which I think profoundly Heideggerian. And then the other would be, maybe I just implied that,
Mhm.
that notion of, well, let's not call it humans as though there's some sort of rational individual like a species, right?
Yeah.
There is this interesting thing called thinking that was made possible, right? And yet it's made possible, but very rarely takes place,
Yeah.
right?
It has to
And
come from
so,
outside, right? It has to
yeah, it
be
has to. And so Heidegger thinks it's by some form of restoration and thinking, right?
yes.
But it's the same problem. And I I mean, how would we decide this? But I would disagree with you on like its place in difference and repetition, that it was put in there begrudgingly.
Okay, okay, okay.
I mean, if we had a little reconstruction, like if we're doing a Deleuze biopic, it might be that someone said, this is actually Heidegger, and Deleuze would have read some Heidegger and like, yeah, I guess, you're right. I just conveniently decided to not footnote Heidegger because that would be
Yeah. But it is a big footnote in the French
huge.
and
And
in
it's and I think that wanting to think the problem of the human, but not as a natural kind, that's going to go all through Deleuze and Deleuze and
yes.
Guattari's corpus, right? There is this thing called thinking that doesn't take place, but you can't identify it with a simple material or natural capacity, right? It's not something cognitive evolution or cognitive paleontology could give you an answer to, right? It has to come out through, you're the Simondon person, techniques, right? An understanding of the things that enable us to think.
It's not a natural given. You're right for Deleuze, for Simondon. It's not something to recover from some ancient past, as you said. It's also it's contingent, right? It's
Completely contingent.
yeah.
This is where I think Deleuze is also Hegelian.
Oh, ooh,
Okay,
wow.
so it could
Double bomb. We're just
yeah,
bombing.
just throwing in the H words here.
Yeah.
Okay, there's thinking has a history. It
Mhm.
has a
Yes.
technical history. Now, here's the non-Hegelian bit. You said it's completely contingent. Thinking absolutely may not have happened.
Yes.
However, once it has happened, you then look back and realize the struggle it constantly takes to
Yes.
emerge. And that's a Hegelian history. There are all these attempts for thinking to emerge, right? And they constantly misrecognize themselves in every philosopher, right?
Yep.
Is a
Yep.
struggle with being seduced by images of what counts as thinking.
Yeah, orthodoxy, the
But yes,
moral, the dogmatic image of
yeah.
thought.
But if
Yeah.
you want to understand what thinking is, you have to go back and look at that struggle. That's why, even at the end, in what is philosophy, you still have where Descartes thought he was onto thinking, but failed. Where
Yeah.
Kant thought he was onto thinking, but failed. And
Yeah.
unless you understand, here's the Hegelian bit, those failures aren't because they were mistaken. It's
Right.
there's something about thinking that will, not always, that's not the word. There's something about thinking that will tend to misrecognize itself and have an image of itself and think, I'm a good thinker, right?
There's this quote that Duluth has, because you know about the Wollens. He recently talked about the Black Notebooks. I mean, like showing more and more about Heidegger's editors who tried to whitewash the Nazism and stuff. But in negotiations, I believe Deleuze is talking about it may be in dialogues. I have to look back, but he's talking about Heidegger, and he's like, is Heidegger a bit of a Nazi? Yes, of course. Right. Like
Yeah,
Deleuze is like, sure, this
yeah,
is back in the 70s when Deleuze is like, oh yeah. But Deleuze is like, look, I'm not interested in that. That's a more historiographical question. I'm interested in the way that Heidegger reactivates the question of the history of philosophy. And I think that's, if you're right about Deleuze not begrudgingly, as you say, inserting Heidegger into difference repetition, it's the fact that Heidegger reactivates the question of the role of the history of philosophy and the way in which each philosophy kind of reactivates not only the question of philosophy itself, but a kind of metaphilosophical investigation about the role of problems, questions. What is thinking, if you will, for Deleuze? It's a different answer and it's a different way of solving, and it's involved with the event, right? It takes a different lineage than
yeah.
Heidegger. And so I always found that way of framing the thing where it's like, look, obviously the shiny keys, the piece of candy over here is Heidegger's Nazism, and we can get fascinated by that. And that's its own thing that we have to deal with. Sure. But I think for Deleuze, the way that Heidegger brings up the question of the history of philosophy, I think entices Deleuze more, because that itself can constitute a series of questions and answers, a series of determining problems that can raise the issue in a way that can bring food to thought, whereas Heidegger's Nazism can just lead to negations.
It
Right.
can. I mean, I think there's the Nazism question where
Mhm.
did he or did he not have affiliations with National Socialism?
Mhm.
Okay, that's the empirical question.
Yes.
But the deeper question, I think, even though Deleuze thinks that's not his domain, and Deleuze and Guattari still in what is philosophy, as you know, they are concerned with microfascisms and
Yes.
fascism as a form of thinking, right? And
Yes.
that's where, if Heidegger is a Nazi at the empirical level, it's because there's something about that important problem of philosophy that
Mhm.
flirts always with fascism, right?
Yes.
That's the question of the proper, because you can start with the Heideggerian problem is no one's really thinking, right?
Yep.
Which is a
Yep.
diagnostic problem. Speaking of Ian Buchanan, not because, like, speaking of
Not because he's a fascist.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, he recently made this point that everyone goes, Deleuze and Guattari are not about lack, but that gives you this sort of everything is awesome, everything is becoming. That's
Everything is awesome. Yeah.
everything is awesome, right?
Yeah.
But it's not, because they clearly think something is wrong, right?
Yes. Yes.
Right? There's clearly something to be addressed in Anti-Oedipus, from Anti-Oedipus to what is philosophy. It's variously in Anti-Oedipus. Why do people mistake desire, like mistake their own desires? Why are people constantly,
Yes.
the political problem? Why are people in, and I think there's somewhere, about self-enslavement, right? But there's a fascist solution to that, which is to just drive a bus through. Like, you don't know what's good for you. Therefore, right,
Yep.
I,
Yep.
as philosopher king, am simply going to dictate the form of the proper, which
Yep.
is to destroy culture in its present form and get back to what you really want. And I think that comes out clearly in Heidegger, right? All these things that you're seduced by, you oughtn't to be, and there's some form of authentic, proper return.
Yeah.
That's the fascist.
Authenticity.
Yeah,
Yeah.
authenticity becomes some sort of drive to the return to the proper. Whereas for Deleuze and Guattari, it's how do you negotiate saying thinking is not taking place without installing some form of the proper, and where the philosopher king comes in and says, here's what thinking properly
Right.
is. Now, did they actually solve that problem? I don't think so, but they at least tried to wrench the problem away from the idea that there is something called proper thinking and we need to find it or regain it. It's
Yeah.
what we have currently is improper thinking, right? It's not really, it's cliche, it's communication, it's banality. What would count as thinking is not some version of proper thinking, right?
You saying banality makes me think of Pascal, right? Where I know that that's not a big reference for Deleuze, but that makes me think of Pascal's notion that evil is this kind of infinite banality, and I think that's part of the notion where you're right, where even if they don't solve it, and that's okay, they help to reframe and re-problematize the question, and it's in that we regain a certain dimension of power, because it's for Deleuze, it's always, look, the problems that we're given when we're quote unquote students, the kind of bad problematic of thinking is we're sort of giving these questions and problems that we have to solve on a test. We have to circle in A, B, C, D. That deprives us of power because we aren't the ones determining the problem itself, right? We're sort of given the problems that are ready made for us. And so I think that way of framing it is an interesting way of approaching these things. And honestly, Claire, I'm so excited to just keep talking about Deleuze with you, but I know that we have your book to talk about, and I think that we can carry this energy on as we delve deeper into. You told me, I'm just making sure, hasn't been published yet. Is it out
I
for
think
the?
it's out. Yes.
It's out for the populace. Okay,
It's
so
like in time for Christmas or I don't know,
I,
Thanksgiving gifts. I don't know. Right?
I know that when we talked, because we started talking around early June, maybe May, and you were saying it was forthcoming, and you
Yeah, it's out.
graciously gave us the forward copy. So okay, so it is out.
Yeah.
And Coop, I'm also saying this for your sanity, because I know Claire and I were getting into the weeds. We're getting a little bit out of that jouissance, talking about
No, I think
stuff.
I think it segues perfectly into the cinematic ontology, actually.
This is a phrase that Coop has come up with, because we just did Virilio's War in Cinema before talking with you, and there are a lot of interesting connections. I'm thinking specifically about, for example, your analysis of a film like Nope, but you're also this question, which can maybe segue us, if you will, Coop, to give it back to Claire, because you do answer this in the text. But do you want to say maybe a little bit for the audience who hasn't read the book, where or what prompted? I mentioned some of your earlier, I say earlier, but it's very recent, your earlier works in 2015, 17, 18, your essays on extinction. Do you want to say a little bit about where this title, this question comes from? Who would you kill to save the world? Do you want to segue us into talking about your very recently published book?
I'll start with that title and then go back to essays in extinction. So
okay, good.
Jordan Peele's film Us, right?
Okay.
I think is a profound metaphysical existential text. Have I ever met Jordan Peele? Like, no. Do I want to? No, in case, right? It turns out that I'm completely wrong, because that doesn't matter, right? The film is what it is, and it's a profound metaphysical investigation in which it's a classic horror film in which they are out to get you and they're your double. But the film ends with a woman, apart from killing her own children, which is sort of interesting, having to kill her own self in order to survive.
Yes.
And the desire of the film, so this is maybe the cinematic ontology component, right? Who you are and what you desire is affected by watching the film, right? We watch things all the time where people are being killed, right?
Yes,
and we desire their killing, right? All the time. The most moralistic films include the desire to kill someone. Saving Private Ryan, just off the top of my head, but
James Bond films, right?
James Bond films, the recent, because I just flew back from Australia, you watch every blockbuster there. The recent Black Panther film, you have to kill off these pseudo-indigenous peoples.
Avatar, you that was another film you analyzed.
Avatar, right? It's so it then turns out, right, the twist at the end of Us is that the person you think is doing the killing is actually the person who was killed, right?
Is actually the doppelganger, right?
The doppelganger.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter. It's like that undoes the self-other distinction, because who you are is the person who's doing the killing. So that is where the type. I actually watched that film and I thought, that is not just that film, it's every film.
It's every film. Okay.
Is about the destruction of the other that constitutes your right to life. And then going back to essays on extinction, it's the case, right? We are this was perhaps less the case when I wrote the book or started writing the book. It's the case that we're living in the 21st century. We've got the planet to a state where there is almost certainly going to be mass misery and suffering, right? Kim Stanley Robinson opens Ministry for the Future with this scene of like impending ecocide. We've brought the world to the point where just suffering and barbarism is built into it, right? It's not an accident in the way like the Lisbon was an accident. And you could ask, how could God be so cruel to produce this earthquake? It's not, oh my God, there's an earthquake. How do we justify this? This is, how do we justify ourselves, right? Is now like the human question. And what amazes me is that a lot of human philosophers think that we can justify ourselves quite simply, because the idea is, well, it's true, things have not been great in the past, but clearly we can turn this around. Clearly, right?
Peter Singer, you
Peter
can
Singer,
imagine,
right?
You can imagine a kind of ethical
Absolutely.
thing where we're not so bad. We're not so bad.
No, and all we have to do is adjust the scales a bit late, right?
Yep.
Or my philosophical bête noire is Nick Bostrom at Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford, who says, look, the number one problem facing us today is existential risk. And it's true that the Holocaust, and he refers to it as the Spanish flu, true that we lost a lot of lives, but if you look at it in the grand scheme of things, we recover. What's really problematic is losing intelligence. Now, to me, that sounds like an extreme.
Oh, you go hard on Bostrom.
I go hard on him because I think he captures the logic of every.
It's eugenicist logic.
I mean,
right?
This is Nick Land's current logic too. We were speaking of Nick Land earlier. This is his thing too. Is like the machinic intelligence is the
right. And as long as intelligence survives, everything's going to be okay. Now that would be. I wouldn't harp on it so much if I thought it was just some extreme position from Oxford privilege. I mean, there was some media event where someone dug up a racist email from him from ages ago, and I'm like, you think this is news?
Right.
Like, oh my God, Nick Bostrom made a
racist tweet from Nick Land. Oh my God.
Like no one saw that coming. But this is the logic of a lot of what passes as posthumanism, which is it's true that things have been a little grimy in the past, and I would say some readings of Deleuze, but look, you know, everything is awesome, right? We have this potentiality to regroup, regrow, be creative, and it misses, it just completely erases, right, the malevolence that is everywhere around us that makes our existence possible.
The question, who would you kill to save machinic intelligence or whatever you wanted to rename?
As long as everything continues, it's fine, right? So yes, there's been a lot of destruction and barbarism, racism, slavery, colonialism, ... right? But the idea is that by looking back at that past, there can be some redeemed future.
Mm-hmm.
And this cannot be an opinion, right? How can you possibly whitewash actuality? Here is the history of the world. What gives you this inalienable right to life and futurity, other than a failure to look at what is actually the case? And so that's where this notion of it's of a virtual humanity, not in Deleuze's sense, but a virtual humanity. Whatever humanity is, it's never been what actually took place, right? It's what we ought to have been. So nearly every US film about slavery, there's always, look at those people back then who did this. I can shed a tear about that now because I know that we are no longer that, right?
Yeah.
And I don't see the evidence. I'd want to see some evidence that we are no longer that.
I mean, I think this is where someone like, I think you may mention it. I'm trying to think if you do. I may be wrong. Or maybe I was reading your book and I texted Coop because he and I are always like, we get excited about the books we're reading. And I may have mentioned to Coop about Django Unchained, where it kind of tries to take some of your ideas and subvert the notion about us as being better, right?
Yeah.
Where it kind, I'm not saying that it totally flouts what you're doing, and we haven't really even started to dig into, but you've provided a nice intro. But where Tarantino's film is kind of trying to follow some of the points you're making, and at each point is trying to say that no, we're not necessarily better, and but at the same time we may exult in the rise of Django and his revenge, right, on all of his, on slavery, for example, as you mentioned, and may celebrate him as a figure that's saying that reconfirms your point, where it's like, oh, we're better now.
Yeah.
Also, who would you kill to save the world, in a sense? For Django, I think, too.
Yes,
Plays a role.
Huge role, right? And part of that, going back to your phrase, I don't know what you meant by it, but cinematic ontology, is that it's not that there's a world and cinema somehow represents or captures that.
Right.
It's that what counts as a world worth saving and what counts as who we are is produced cinematically.
Yes.
And that's before cinema exists explicitly as an industry.
Absolutely.
It exists by who is taking command of viewing the world, who is viewed as an object, right?
100%, yes.
And that's produced through various forms of technology, right? And the later versions of that technology are cinema explicitly. But I think this is in the book, in Paradise Lost, Milton depicts Adam after the fall, looking back on all of history and seeing the devastation. And he goes, well, just kill me now. Humanity's, Milton actually asked the question, like, why does humanity have the right to exist given how barbarous history's been? He's writing at a time of revolution, right? He's writing at a time of
Cromwell.
Yeah, but also there's the possibility of a genuinely collective, stateless society, right, that doesn't take place, right? So what do you do when there's been a revolution to achieve the overthrowing of the state? People might be starting to think, and then they say, no, you have to think, how can humans go on self-enslaving, right?
Yeah.
And Adam's like, yeah, just end it now. Humans just shouldn't exist. And then the theological answer comes in, but don't worry, it's not always going to be like this. You have reason, and reason is going to give you your proper future, which is paradise, right? Paradise is where we're all rational.
Paradise lost, paradise regained,
Yeah.
right? That's the vision.
And paradise regained is recognizing that you enslaved yourselves by not thinking, and that all you need to do is think and talk and reason, and you'll find your proper humanity, right?
You know, it's so interesting you bring this up, because we just had an episode on Etienne de la Boetie, and his kind of thing is like, hey, if the populace just recalls their consent to the tyrant, then they'll fall like a colossus whose pedestal has been, swept beneath them.
Yeah.
And in theory, and just talking about it, it seems so simple. And perhaps to a certain extent, theoretically, again, it seems so simple to instigate
It is
revolution,
theoretically,
revolt.
but everything in so I just at the last Deleuze conference heard an amazing paper by Nick Thoburn, who wrote like the book on Deleuze and Marx. And his claim is like the proletariat is not the working class, right? The proletariat doesn't exist because capitalism does everything it can to undo the sense of we subjected
Of a class,
ourselves,
right?
What it does is constantly undo the possibility of what you just referred to, reflecting that you gave your consent. Instead of you gave your consent, right? This was an act that took place where you transferred sovereignty. Instead of that being made explicit, everything in capitalism works to distract that event of theoretical awareness. So you're right, theoretically, it would be simple. It's so fucking obvious all the time, right? That there has been this passing over of desire, right? This abandonment of desire.
And I
it's
think
obvious, but the obviousness of it is totally undone by attention capturing technologies, cinema.
That's kind of the theme of the book that we're discussing. And one last thing before we can move on is, in Anti-Oedipus, we had a episode with Ray Brazier, who took issue with some of the themes of Anti-Oedipus, where they say something very similar to what you just mentioned about the there's only one class, it's the bourgeoisie, right? They are the ones kind of running things, and it's their rules and regulations and program. And the proletariat, for them, is what they call the outclass, the whore class, right? The not whore in the sense of prostitution, but in the sense of outside. They're outside of class. And for Ray, he thought of this as an abandonment of sort of classical Marxist frameworks. But I think that in a certain sense, I think that that just shows a shift where they are moving away from the analysis of ideological frameworks, for example, Althusser and obviously Marx and otherwise. They're moving away from the analysis based on ideology, because for them that's kind of a false problem. They're trying to get back to this bedrock of what they call desire, which they try to revamp and renew in A Thousand Plateaus and etc. But I always took it as that perhaps, again, I'm not speaking for Ray or against him really, but I didn't necessarily take it as a way of denying class struggle, but of reframing it in a way that the struggle is more fundamental, and it's not about being
or that when you refer to class, there's a class that doesn't exist, right? That one way to think about the proletariat, it's not the working class as a concrete body of laborers, right? So that shifting it to think the proletariat as if this could gain consciousness, right? If this collective could gain consciousness, then there would be some collective awareness, right? It's
Mhm.
not about individual apprehension, right? It would be about some formation that could exist outside forms of capitalist desire.
Right, right.
And so that would make sense of the phrase "the people are missing," right?
Yes.
And why Deleuze and Guattari don't refer to this was Nick Thoben's point, which struck me as just true in terms of Deleuze and Guattari's scholarship, but also insightful in terms of what actually is the
Yeah.
case, right? There is no working class in the image we would have of a unionized body of workers who have a clear idea of a political struggle and possible outcomes. That does not exist, or if it does exist, that's not the proletariat, right? The proletariat is what would happen if this mass desire that's constantly being undone by capital, right,
Mhm. Mhm.
could reflect upon, seize upon its own desire,
Yeah.
right? And that would, that's when you get a non-Heideggerian version of like what might it be to get thinking to take place, right? And it certainly
Right.
wouldn't be going back and reading a lot of Plato.
This was a thing that kept coming to mind, and I actually wrote it down because it struck me reading your book, where you said the people are missing, but I kept thinking of the people to come, right? The becoming Devenir tout le monde, right? Like the becoming
Right.
of everything, of everybody. I kept thinking of the people to come was a theme in your book that you didn't, obviously you were writing in a way that was talking to everyone, everybody. It wasn't necessarily trying to put these things in Deleuze speak, but I was kind of translating in my head, thinking about your background and thinking about obviously my own little fetish
Yeah.
I was trying to think about the people to come would perhaps be the target audience for this question that you pose in the title of your book about who would you kill to save the world.
Or
And
not, because I think you can think of the people to come has this redemptive, um,
right, okay, yeah,
post-humanist notion that it's true that if you look back at the history of humanity, or at least at the Western humanity, or what has called itself humanity, right, which is the better way to think about it, because if you added up all the human bodies in the world, not all of them identify with this thing that has called itself humanity, right?
right,
But if we look back at that history of so-called or soi-disant humanity, it always justifies itself by what it will be, and that is fascist, right? That is
yes,
uh,
yes,
a sense that there is a proper futurity that we have an absolute right to, and that end dictates the means. And I think the forms of post-humanism that immediately seize upon a we that has a right to life that isn't them, where
yeah,
them is those capitalists, as we say in Australia, they need to take a good, long, hard look at themselves. Right?
mm-hmm,
Because that we that has a right to life, that has a clear enemy, capitalism, right, is a form of microfascism, right?
yeah,
It has, if I could just clear away this enemy, I would be my proper self. As opposed to what's micropolitics really? Looking at the microfascisms that compose us, right?
yeah, the cop in our heads
Yeah,
as
right? That if I could just, and I think this has like really concrete implications. If you look how lazy politics became or is in the era of Donald Trump, it's if I could just get rid of that orange monster, racism will be over. Now,
right,
I was not speaking for you two. I feel that seductive impulse in myself, right? I recently became a citizen here and I was able to vote. I've never been that good a voter, like in Australia where it's compulsory. I've been known to fail to vote.
I won't tell
No,
the
don't tell anyone.
authorities. I won't
Don't
tell the
tell anyone.
authorities. Okay.
Oh, I got fined, right? So,
Yes,
the authorities knew. But I think that this notion of a people to come in the very abstract has really concrete political implications, in that if one feels that humanity is pretty much okay if we could just eliminate X, right? This makes sense.
Right.
Then the people to come will be this virtual and therefore proper humanity. So I think that people are missing, right, is better, because that's never going to, right? The people are missing is that proper humanity just doesn't ever really take place.
The way you put that kind of reminds me of something in Being an Event, Badu. He's talking about belonging and inclusion.
Right.
There's always this missing element, whether it
Yes.
be the undocumented. That's its own thing that we could go into. But it's funny, Coop. I'm putting you on the spot here. I know that in the last election, I was kind of like, look, man, I don't like this guy. I'm just gonna do my part. I'm in Georgia, which is it's purple because it's got the purple. Atlanta is blue, but so much of where I grew up, kind of like Coop, is red. So I voted against Trump, just to be honest. And
I
Coop,
mean, I think there's there's a molar politics, which that is,
yes,
right?
yes.
This is the game we're in, and you wouldn't want to be so sanctimonious, right, to only play. Like, I think there's that line in, not that it matters that much what Deleuze and Guattari think, but there's that line about, you got to play the game of women's struggles, right? You don't give that up. That's part of it, but there's also micropolitics, which would be, and I mean, I think the women's struggles example was interesting. It's like, I'll do what I can for feminist politics, but don't then cover over all the forms of racism and transphobia that are intrinsic to feminism, right? I'll vote for this, right? But don't believe that those molar political struggles are going to really shift anything at the level of desire. And the level of desire comes in when you recognize that actually changing the face at the top doesn't change the structure of desire, right? It's not about electing the right person. Right? The problem is the investment in any person, right? Any person, right? Even if it's Cornel West, right?
I mean, you're right, and he's. I mean, gosh, lately he's kind of. That's a whole can of worms.
It's a whole can of worms, but the idea would be, let's assume it's not a can of worms, right? And there is this. Let's not look too closely and just assume there's this incredibly awesome person. The problem would be it's still a politics of the face and the state, and that X will save us, and X will save us because who we are is intrinsically fine. If it weren't for, right, if we could just get rid of X, the people in the South, Donald Trump, the Republicans, right, but whatever, that who we are remains, like, all we need to do is kill off X and we're golden.
You're answering the fundamental question about the meaning of the title of your book. That's
over and over.
That's an interesting thing that you bring up. And Coop, I was going to go to you. So just let me finish this thought and then I'll cede the day. I believe it's the apparatus of capture plateau, where they kind of go into this about how, obviously they're already elaborating on the concepts of the minoritarian, on becoming a woman, and these other things which you've written on, and I'm sure you could speak on at length. It's not that struggling on the level of the molar is bad or should be given up completely, right? They don't say that that's something to deny. It's merely that, for them, as you said, it starts, you might want to say, like, politics starts at home or some shit, right? Like that some kind of truism where it's, it does begin with changing our means of conceiving, again, micropolitically,
Right, or politics starts with not politics starts at home, but politics starts with homelessness. Like, how would you act if you could somehow not universalize your attachments, right? Like, if you could imagine a world without you in it, and by you,
Yeah.
all the things that you think are absolutely sacrosanct, like the university and the humanities, and maybe those aren't prima facie worth saving or unquestionably worth saving, or like, what if saving the United States were
Yeah. Yeah.
something one were not unquestionably attached to, right? So I think you see that in Difference and Repetition, when Deleuze talks about fate and says usually fate is associated with a lack of freedom. It's like, no, actually, if you thought of ultimately everything passes away, right? That's the beginning of freedom, right? I'm no longer like attached to saving myself. It's maybe a Stoic idea, but it's the beginning of micropolitics, right? Which is not moving the pieces we already have on the checkerboard or chessboard or whatever game we're playing. But there is no board, there's no game anymore.
Affirming the whole of chance,
Exactly. Yeah.
I and my attachments and my personal desires don't necessarily come back in some sort of heaven or in some sort of right.
Yes.
That's where we affirm the extremes, and it's hard. It's
So
difficult.
hard, right? Yes.
It's difficult, but as you say, that's the way to defeat the. I'll put this in your mouth, but I'm not trying to. But that's how we defeat the cop in our head that is making us affirm the 14 words of, I got to secure a future for my people and my kind. I mean, this is what Deleuze and Guattari kind of say over and over again in Anti-Oedipus, when they talk about becoming, when they talk about the legitimate synthesis of consumption, consummation, when they talk about how it's about being of a bastard race for all eternity. It's not about affirming that I am a part of the blessed Aryan race and that's what needs to be saved.
Yeah,
right.
That's right.
I'm just ancillary and alongside the machines.
Yes.
I am just a kind of
a
effect.
And that goes back to maybe class consciousness. It's to embrace not the will of the people, right? But to embrace a form of destitution and non-self-consciousness, right? And what it might be to no longer have an attachment to a proper image of humanity. And that would be if people are missing, right?
I was going to put it on Coop because I know you have your thoughts about molar politics, but I will say we can, since you're governing us, if you will, we can move forward, or we can jump off of the next spot.
I would just like to bring up that I think that maybe there's something in a micro-fascist sense about the cinematic ontology. The whole structure of it automatically traps you into this idea of this messianic figure of rationality and so forth, which goes back to the ancient Egyptians, even in the sense of not only the collective investment of the social into the figure of the pharaoh as the one who brings renewal and rebirth to society as a whole, but the way that the Egyptians also in their sort of frescoes, you don't say cinematic ontology, that's me putting words in your mouth, but I think it is there. You mentioned earlier that the technology now obviously exists, but the Egyptians were certainly, I think, trying to represent movement in their frescoes. So I think this sort of position, or this like the cinematic ontology, is not necessarily something that's new. It's something that's been around humanity for quite some time.
Absolutely. What's it's interesting you mentioned Egyptians and frescoes, because this idea for me was inspired by Bernard Stiegler, and his conception that time is the experience of who we are, like being someone who can say who I am, comes through technologies. And those technologies can be something as simple as a teacup, because then there's something stored there that I know to pick it up, to put it down, to pour tea into it. So it's stored time.
Right.
And his references is to cave paintings, because when I look at that, I don't just see that it's a picture of a animal I can hunt. I can see that someone else had that desire. But just your reference to the Egyptians, right, is an action and movement. There's a book, I think, that was it was very influential for Deleuze and Guattari, Voringer's Abstraction and Empathy, right,
Okay.
which is about forms of art that are organic, like I look at a human form and I feel, right, versus abstraction, a pyramid, geometric shapes, which are a different form of apprehension. And if you think about what Deleuze and Guattari were trying to do with cinema, if we take your phrase, cinematic ontology, right, there's something about looking at faces and movement and a coherent world of action that gives you a desire, a teleological shape. I want the body I'm looking at to stay alive. I want it to triumph over adversity, right? Point of view, empathy. But then there's cinema that destroys that, right? It's just that we don't see it in cinema very often, and we don't want to watch it, right? Which is the cinema that tears narrative apart, that destroys empathy, that doesn't give you coherent narrative time. That's why I guess Deleuze celebrates avant-garde cinema. But I think that really raises a problem for like the 21st century, because it makes no sense for us, like us three here, to say, well, the answer to capitalism and sympathetic forms of posthumanism that just want to maintain one's attachments, right? If I'm nice enough to nature and animals, I'll stay alive. You can't advocate avant-garde cinema as a way of destroying that. Can you? I don't think you can. I think that makes no sense. Like, we've all got to go back and watch some Tarkovsky. That has a sort of fascistic tone to it, right? Like, I'm going to advocate the forms of cinema that will detach you from your interests. So it becomes what sort of political forms, what sort of political aesthetics would sort of counter that narcissistic cinematic ontology, where we're all just investing in images of ourselves.
I was talking to a friend last night. Shout out to Griffin for bringing this to my attention. He's a big Werner Herzog fan, and he was going through Herzog's, if you will, manifesto, but I don't know what you call it, his screed against cinema verite, and I was kind of digging into how the lambasting against cinema verite, as though the screen or the eye of the camera could be objective, neutral, disinterested, could sort of escape from whether it be ideology or an image of thought that did not have any desire or any perspective, as though perspective could be.
Yeah, it's the dream of the archive free. Like, you could have, fat free, sugar free, and then archive free. It just is. It's pure presence, unmediated.
And so it kind of reminded me a little bit about what you were trying to get at with, I guess, you were putting us as the viewer front and center, but if we kind of take Coop's notion of cinematic ontology, as though the director were not giving us the vantage, as though it were just sort of context free, and it's very insidious. And obviously you can see this in various types of art, whether it be social realism or again in various types of image of thought that claim to have no presuppositions. And we think about the start of image of thought chapter, where it's like, well, Descartes starts with, I think therefore I am, and gets rid of perhaps subjective presuppositions, but has these objective presuppositions embedded in them, where it's like, well, what about the transcendental idiot who asked the question that no one's willing to ask, which is like, what does it mean to think? What does it mean to be? right? So I kind of see some of those not perspectives, those ideas, let's just say,
Yeah.
in the framework of your book, which kind of puts us, again, us, I say us, not necessarily the royal we, but us as, whether it be subjects or
Yeah.
whatnot, front and center, and saying, like, what about our attachments? As I'll use your word that you've been saying here, you don't really say that in the book, but what about our attachments? What about our, ways of clinging to something to hold on to, that if we could just exercise and ward off sort of this problematic other that isn't a part of us, right? As
Yeah.
though it's not. What if we could just exercise that other, and we would save ourselves? That would be the way of reframing your book. Like, who could we kill off to save ourselves? Right? That would be perhaps like a kind of reframing of the
Yeah.
title of your book that
Yeah.
you call into question.
Correct. Yes.
What about the camera as the inscription surface through light? And we talked about in Virilio's War in Cinema the way that, to tie this to who do we need to kill, right? With regard to warfare, like it's
Mhm.
light that exposes who we can kill,
Right.
which is
And
sort of interesting.
it is interesting and crucial because the war is really at the level of techniques and the technologies that compose us, because it's what we see and what we think are effects of technology, whether that's the technology of language or gesture or
Right. Yeah.
books we have in the archive we have. And so I think one of the earlier comments, wasn't Lazzarato, but someone else, where there's talking about this technically, some reflection on the constant machinations of the capitalist machine to preclude apprehension of itself, right? So this
Exactly.
is the fact that we're organized bodies gives us our little world, right? Our ready-made world and our attachments. And so the clearest example is how the cinematic eye, EYE, but also I, right, gives one a very meaningful world. It gives one a narrative world, right, where there is clear good and evil. And that's our current technological landscape as well. Like, nothing is more moral than social media. And not just because you get algorithms that keep repeating you back to yourself, right, or allow for an antagonism, but it's become a game rather than absolute chance, right? So it has become point scoring and with its own metrics, right? That's also what I would mean by a cinematic ontology as well. I just think that is a really good phrase, because it's not that there's an ontology of cinema, although that's another thing, right,
Yeah.
that people have looked at, but it's that what counts as existing is the effect of the technologies that produce the scene, right, for us. There's something like, I know Roncière, that's his shtick, right, about what's apprehendable and what can be seen, right? But I think the question of technologies has to go like to a more profound level than, let's say, just the cinematic camera in its narrow sense, and the archive of technologies that compose us, from language to screens to the spaces we inhabit.
Yeah, I think there's something to do with just like the notion of inscription and like capturing desire.
Yes.
Lazzarato talks about how there's the machinic enslavement aspect, which is at the molar level. There's an omnipotence to capitalism, and I think that omnipotence is like this collective, everyone and no one is the director of capitalism, right? Like it is a multiplicity that
Yes.
we all sort of, almost like the little like monads on the sort of celestial Leibnizian body without organs. Like we all have our little component section of the reality that we're creating that all sort of gets jumbled together as a big continuity of reality of that sort of
Yes, and that those like the big other does not exist. There is no capitalist other that's pulling the strings of the
Right.
machine. It's just that there is a machine. It's composed from, as you said, like 1,000 tiny apprehensions, right? That no one is the author of, right? It's an authorless, godless, groundless multiplicity, right? There is no big C capitalist out there. It's not Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos.
I was gonna say, or the Jews, which is like,
right, exactly.
Yeah.
The big other does not exist, right? And I think there's two ways you can take it. You can take it in the sort of negative Lacanian sense, right? The other does not exist, so you just have to sort of shut the fuck up and live with this alienation. Or you have that question of Deleuze, how can you compose an apprehension of those tiny little perceptions that compose the whole? And that gets you back to micropolitics and the things that you can do to take command of the techniques. And they're always going to have to be guerrilla tactics, aren't they? Right? Like the state only exists in this coagulation of a machine. And all you can try and do is like undo these machinic coagulations.
To piggyback off of what you just said, we had Andrew Culp on, whose recent book is about guerrilla tactics, and I'll give a shout out to our sort of brother quote sister podcast, Acid Horizon, whose new book is coming out about
right ocularity, yeah,
I would
anti-oculus, yeah,
anti-oculus.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
With Deleuze and Guattari, there is a strategy of becoming imperceptible that's involved that may even go to the heart of your book. That could be a way of summing up where, instead of perpetually making ourselves perceptible to the screen or to the camera eye or to ourselves and putting ourselves front and center, there is this notion of becoming imperceptible, probe head, whatever you want to call it, like using
larval subjects, whatever.
Larval subjects, right? Exactly, whereby we are not perpetually, like, what do you say, centering our own narcissism, right? There is a sense in which your book too is about, insofar as we are trying to kill the fascist in our head, the cop in our head, there's also a sense in which we are trying to undo the narcissist in our psyche, in our soul.
Yes. And I think and one way to talk about that would be the deprivatization of desire, right? It's to undo the sense that your desires are your own, they're authored by yourself, they're
right.
Right? There's seeing as we're plugging books, Geordie, I don't know if you know Geordie Rosenberg's Confessions of the Fox.
No.
Amazing novel. Even though it's a novel, I think it's the best theorization of the privatization of desire, precisely because if you think about one of the arguments against identity politics, like the bad arguments against identity politics, that you're trying to take political issues, like broader political issues, and turn them into just questions of speaking as a woman, right? As though identity is something you own. Whereas, of course, to be able to say that, right, to be able to have an identity is the outcome of so many complicated desiring machines that you don't own, right? And that would mean deprivatizing, yes, that's a word, desire, and thinking about the capacity to be an organized body with desires and a sexual identity is the outcome of a geopolitical history, state history. I'm going to put a strong recommend on that book.
Yeah, I mean,
and maybe as a future guest, awesome scholar who happened to write a novel, so primarily.
Well, we'll have to, since you recommended, we'll have to follow up on that. I'm just thinking,
totally.
When you talked about deprivatization, I was thinking about gosh, I think it's the very first section of chapter 3 of Oedipus where they talk about
Correct. Yeah.
the anus is the first organ to be
Yeah.
privatized, right?
Yes.
Like
Right. Like
I
we can't have the flows of life be seen as the flows of life, right? They have to be owned, controlled, and held to be one's own. It's a crazy line in anti-Oedipus, and that's probably, they were reading a lot of Artaud at the time, right?
yeah, right.
But it's crazy, but sometimes like you just pause, and the fact that it is so crazy is possibly what means you ought to take it seriously, because it's
Yeah.
thinkable to, to imagine a world in which the flows of the body were not one's own.
Guattari goes on and on about this, not just because he worked at Laborde, where it is collective analysis, but he tries to reiterate over and over again how fantasies are group fantasies. They're not our own little individual private cinemas in our head.
Yeah, exactly.
He tries to reiterate how, and again, this kind of goes back to it, how we desire to sort of fuck and be fucked by the socius, right? Like this is
Yes.
kind of, and again, we can pause at these jokes, even the opening lines of Andy Oedipus, where like it shits, it fucks, like it was a, what do they say? The id, right? To ever
Yes.
said the id is a problem in of itself. We can laugh at that and whisk it away because it does present us with these thoughts that are alien normal to the dogmatic, to the normal image of thought, right? So
Yeah.
that's good. I'll definitely take what was
Geordie Rosenberg.
Jordy
Confessions of the Fox.
Okay, well,
I'd recommend.
okay, I will try to, and if you are familiar with them in real life, you can help set us up, but otherwise
Absolutely.
I do know that we want to talk about a few more things about your book before we close. I was talking about Deleuze and Guattari in my statements in the doc, so we've already done that. We can get to some of your stuff if you'd like.
I think a lot of the themes in the book, because I have this obsession with Dune, which I think touches
Uh-huh.
on a lot of the same things, because it's about being perceived by the oracle, who is also the messianic figure, but that also gets subverted in the way that this desire to not be perceived by higher dimensional beings that passively, as the viewer, being passively viewed sort of robs us of a certain agency,
Right.
or something like that.
Yeah. That's
In a sort of constructivist way, I guess, which I think would go to the sort of anti-ocularity thing.
that
But
reminds there's a passage in Sartre's Being and Nothingness where
Mm-hmm.
and Sartre is like has read all his Hegel, really, like really hardcore, that you can't just have God-like existence. I'm God, there's nothing other than me, I'm just God, right? Pure presence. You have to be God and be recognized as being God, right? So that's Hegel, right? Like you can't just have being, you have to have being that recognizes itself. But you have to have being that recognizes itself, so that it has to be a circle, right? So that would end up with the liberal state where we're all rational, we all recognize each other as rational. You're human, I'm human, everyone is human. We're humans in recognition, closed circle. The nightmare is that something else is watching us, and when right, that alien apprehension, right? But of course, that circle is never closed, right? We are never in command of what views us, and we're certainly never in command of the way we view ourselves, right? Just in the simple, no one actually sees themselves when they look in a mirror, right? It's 1,000 others looking at us. So there's, going back to Sartre, Sartre says it's the desire to be God, to be able to look at oneself and apprehend oneself without any alterity. And he says it's a futile, right? He says,
yeah,
like a futile desire. And then, of course, writes the rest of the book is like, you got to be the person looking and not be the, okay, well, maybe that bit in Being and Nothingness is not so great. But he did understand why I love that section, he did understand this desire to be looker and looked at once and fully in command of yourself. And that is this post-human desire, right? To apprehend oneself and be in command of oneself and not have anything alien or inassimilable or beyond apprehension.
See, I think that's the position of the director of the film too, because I mean, having done some shorts, when you're editing a film that you've shot, you really are putting yourself in the position of being the creator, of being a god of this like micro world. I mean, it really is. I mean, it's the very narcissistic jouissance to taking the discontinuity of chaos and like manipulating it into something that can be mobilizing the powers of the false to be this mirage of continuity that all makes sense and is total and all encompassing. But to build on this, I don't know if this is going to switch gears a little bit, but I think this is very relevant. Have you seen these? Are you familiar with TikTok video? This has been blowing up on social media over the last couple of weeks, and it's what's referred to as NPC videos. So NPCs, like in video games, are sort of the passive characters who just like you'll bump up to them and they have sort of a scripted response. So they don't really have any agency beyond players. Beyond
non-player characters. Yeah,
exactly. Non-playable characters. And so they have this kind of scripted response, etc. So now on TikTok, you have influencers that do participate in this passive way of responding to inputs from the people watching the video. And so
they get paid for it.
Maybe I should like bring this up and play this on the screen so you can kind of see. I think to really
I want to say this.
They get paid. Imagine if there were various ways that the viewers could click on, it looks like an emoji, but it's basically ways of paying the live streamer, the NPC as they're called. So like they click on an ice cream emoji, and they get paid, what is it, like 2, 3, 4 cents? And they have a stock response. The one that went viral is a beautiful female, right? So we could talk about the object of desire and whatnot. I know that there's no sound here, but you can kind of see someone just clicked an ice cream thing, and she's kind of almost robotically responding to. So like the ice cream emoji gets things. She does the lick, like I'm licking.
So the object speaks back.
Yeah.
The commodity isn't like the commodity is speaking back. The fetishized commodity is speaking.
Yeah, right. That's a good way to put it. Right, there's a way of embodying the
giving voice to the playing the non-player, giving voice to the object.
Exactly.
Objectivizing, right? Putting a face back on. Yeah.
And again, as I said, it's not a coincidence that the one who went viral or made this go broader consciousness is a beautiful woman, right? Who is already objectified, and
who's already, but it's an interesting example because she's blonde but not white, which also, right, like you've got historical sensibilities about what counts as a face of desire and what counts as an object rather than a subject, right?
An exploitable object, right?
Right. And there would have been how many decades ago the impossibility of anything other than a white blonde face occupying that, right? And now what counts as the facialization of desire changes, but one way to my way of looking at that would be just the ongoing commodification and subjective, like anything can become a organized body and speak, right, and be humanized, right? I think that's, this is probably a generational thing that you're looking at, like TikTok videos, and with horror, the Facebook equivalent is these reels where people give voices to their dogs, right? And it's
okay.
This, it's the Oedipalization of
Mhm.
everything, right? The only way to apprehend something is to give it a voice and include its voice in an already given commodified conversation about recognizable desire.
And speaking on this topic, and Coop, if I'm remembering correctly, the reason why this video itself went so large was because she broke character and off screen yells at her son who's off camera and says something about how she's going to give away the dog because it's interrupting her video. She breaks NPC character. Am I right, Coop?
There
She
was,
breaks.
yeah, but I mean that was already after she became sort of a viral
Okay, but
sensation already from the other
the
videos.
video I saw was just about her
Right.
breaking the
Yeah.
NPC
Well,
role.
that's because she had already been exposed as this new
Yeah, that wouldn't be
sensation.
interesting, yes, if she weren't already. Hey,
No, that's fine.
Speaking of,
I just don't.
yeah.
Yeah, there we go. Wait,
Who are you to anthropomorphize me?
yeah. I mean, I wouldn't have seen the video. I don't go on TikTok, so I wouldn't
I
have
don't
seen the
either.
video. I
I
wouldn't have
just know
seen
it
the
from
video
Twitter.
on Twitter if she hadn't had the moment where she
Right.
breaks NPC
Exactly.
character
Okay.
and yells at her son off screen about the dog that's interrupting her stream where she's getting a little bit of sense at the time.
Yeah, but isn't that like all these they're affect economies, aren't they? Like the
yeah.
reaction videos, and it's anything can be given a face, right?
Yeah.
And monetized, right? You can't just play a piece of music. You have to play the piece of music with two people reacting as if for the first time in a fully manufactured way, because music itself would be, I mean, it's always been facialized, right? To allow it to be commodified, increasingly so, right?
I mean, that's an interesting way of saying it, when
Which is to privatize it, right? Because everyone knows that no matter how great the musical artist, right? Prince, Sinead O'Connor, like just take like the last, right? They're not the authors of what ultimately gets attached to the face. It's always a collective, right? That's not to deny there aren't acts of genius, right? But it's to say those acts of genius are always part of a crowd, but that's never the way we apprehend them. They're completely facialized, right? And that goes back to, like, of course, it's that particular face, right? A beautiful, young, buxom woman, right? That helps that one circulate readily, right?
It's almost like the other side of Oedipus is like the ocularity aspect of it, in the sense of like the oracular ability, the teleological structure of sort of relation of being seen, and like time, and I guess sort of a destiny, a narrative that one is caught in, that no matter what you do, you're sort of still contributing to your own sort of subjection to the outcome that you tried so hard to struggle against.
The teleology idea is really, really crucial, because instead of having, there are a whole diffuse, multiplicity events and layers, and an event occurs, you have, I had this thought, here is this output, I am the author, right? And now it has its way in the world. And that notion of one owns one's desire, one manufactures one's desire, one sends it out as output, then one receives the profits from that, is a way of privatizing, monetizing what is ultimately collective, right? And it's face, and you do that, the face becomes increasingly important to that, the face and the proper name.
It's funny that you have a note on faciality.
Yeah, exactly.
The white wall, black hole.
Yeah.
I know that's a Guattari thing. He was fascinated about. Deleuze himself says it in, I think, his letter to the Japanese translator of A Thousand Plateaus, where he's like, "Look, Guattari is fascinated by black holes. He's not trying to." And I was trying to tell this to someone the other day. Often, I talk to people in STEM. They're in science and whatnot, and they think philosophy is meaningless. I can think of the fashionable nonsense, right? The Sokal and Brinkman, and what they don't understand I'm talking about Sokal and Brigmont, is
Yeah.
how someone like Guattari, someone like Deleuze, and Deleuze actually articulates this very well, where it's not about using a concept or an idea from science and importing it in the way in which it's exact, in the way in which science uses it exactly, in the sense of exactitude of calculations. It's an inexact importation whereby it's not about metaphor, right? As Deleuze wants to say, it's about sort of recalibrating the idea so that it can work outside of its specific
But
function
that's
of
what's, the thing
calculation.
about that Sokal and Brigmont is their image that philosophers sort of make things up and play fast and loose,
Right.
right? Is that's what good scientists do. Like, I don't know what idea Sokal and Brigmont had of science, that here's these hard facts and science just, gets the data and relays the data. No scientist thinks that that's the case, right? So
Right.
that was a cheap own goal against continental philosophy. An appalling version of science, which is what now, we're suffering from, people thinking science has some clear grasp of the real, and when it doesn't, we go into a panic. When, of course, that's not what any good science is, as well as we.
No, I mean, it's exactly true, and this gets back to the Herzog cinema verite thing, where I mentioned social realism, but in the sciences, one can think of the dream of mathematics to ballast itself, like for, say, Frege, Russell Whitehead, Principia Mathematica, where it's trying to prove axiomatically that science is, or that mathematics, sorry, can be complete
Yeah.
axiomatically and can be consistent. And someone like Gödel comes along and kind of blows that dream apart and proves it via, set theoretical intra-mathematical means. And I see something similar with the dream of physics with the what's the
Theory of everything.
yeah, basically the universe or universal laws can be summed up in one equation, right?
Yes.
I think that there's something similar going on, where it seems as though this is a part of an image of thought, to use that phrase again. This is a part of a fantasy whereby thinking, calculating can be internally complete and consistent. Where and honestly, I think that if one can see something like Gödel's proof extended and exactly, if you will, to other domains, whereby obviously completeness and consistency are fantasies, are a part of a certain image of thought, where thinking can kind of encapsulate itself in a bubble and be perfect.
That's what's
That
so interesting about Muad'Dib, right?
And Coop and I were talking about this Muad'Dib in Dune, insofar as he's able to tap into his genetic algorithm and kind of see the past and therefore calculate the future. But there are, and this is Guattari's phrasing, obviously Deleuze has problems with quote unquote the possible based on Bergson, but like Guattari is talking about possibilization. This is kind of a phrase that he always talks about, as Muad'Dib, the main character, in Dune, is moving forward with his vision of freeing the Fremen and sort of overthrowing the empire. What is possible narrows, and he has to kind of sacrifice the best outcome, if you will,
Right.
is
Yeah.
in sacrificing his fiance, his wife. I guess I was also thinking about this. This is a great point, Coop. Your Dune fetish. The main hinge of at least the first book of Dune is kind of who would you kill to save the world, and for Muad'Dib, the Messiah figure, if you will, he has to sacrifice his beloved.
Or he would need to kill himself to prevent the horrible future.
What I find interesting is that cinema often asks that question, right? It does have, like, you would have to destroy everything, right?
Yes.
In order to hold on to what you take to be valuable, worth saving, right? What is really interesting in cinema is that it constantly poses that existential question, and then more often than not goes, just
Waves it away, right? Yeah.
waves it away, right? And it's almost as though there's some sort of existential exercise in us confronting the possibility of like one of my favorite films, The Day the Earth Stood Still. If you really, we're here to annihilate humanity because all you've been is violent. And it's like, oh, yeah. And then like, oh, but it's okay. Right? Never mind. Right. It is interesting that does get asked, but not answered.
That's a rendition of Wells's story. There's Asimov in, I think it's the first robot. I think it's just I, Robot, the first robot books, which is kind of a series of actually short stories where there's the aliens come and they're like, we're taking over because humanity can't preserve the three laws. It's going to annihilate itself eventually. And I think that that's part of your perspective in at least your first volume of Essays on Extinction,
Yeah.
where you pose this problem about the Anthropocene and how we are confronted with not only killing off all life, but even killing off what it means to be human. There's a kind of dialectical annihilating kernel to humanity itself. It was kind of like I think I mentioned this to you last night, Coop. Maybe I was talking to someone else about Nietzsche's, Death of God, where it's the very idea of truth, the very idea of this ideal of truth in Platonism and Christianity, that God kind of annihilates himself. So in terms of, even if Nietzsche dramatizes it as we're the ones who killed him, it's actually we're the ones who, in remaining faithful to the idea of the event of truth,
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
God eventually kills himself. So there's something
Yeah.
about that in the kernel of humanity, like
Yes.
whereby humanity kind of is killing itself, is
Is
annihilating itself.
intrinsically self-annihilating, right? There's always, at the very, whatever you think of as like the myth of Western reason, it's always you have to keep killing off all these threats to your own self, whether it's sense perception or
Mm-hmm.
even later in Kant, reason tends to outstep itself, right?
Mm-hmm.
Reason has to constantly undo itself and annihilate its own tendencies. And, that's even there in Deleuze and Guattari and What is Philosophy? It's that everything in philosophy is struggling to think, but it's also constantly undermined, right? Like we have to kill off the whole history of philosophy in order to start doing philosophy properly, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think that's a good point. And gosh, it reminds me how Anti-Oedipus begins with Schreber,
Yes.
whereby Schreber's delirium is that humanity has already died off,
Yeah.
and the very purpose of his becoming woman is to be able to give this sort of infinite, unextinguishable desire of God to be, constantly pleasured in order to give birth to this new humanity.
Yeah.
And it kind of reminds me whereby it's almost Schreber's already he's already on the other side of the question, whereby like, who would you kill to save the world? Well, the world has already been killed. Who do I become to give birth to the people to come? And I think that's why Deleuze and Guattari, they don't say this in A Thousand Plateaus, but it's like becoming always starts with becoming woman. I think that they might be thinking of Schreber, right? Schreber has to become woman to immaculately conceive
Right.
the
Or to
new.
deprivatize sexuality, to have sexuality not one's own. I mean, I don't want to. Yeah, that's a can of worms.
No, I like
Yeah,
cans of
that's
worms.
interesting.
I'm the one that opened it. I
Yeah.
already.
I think
You've written on this, by the way. I know you
I
have.
have, but that's partly because when I started, not just Deleuze, but continental philosophy there weren't as many women working in continental philosophy.
There still aren't. If you
There
wanted
still
to.
aren't, but it was way worse back then. And
Okay.
it always would be like I got the, hey, can you talk about like we're going to talk about Deleuze? Can you talk about becoming,
Oh my God. Okay, I see.
you know about that. And then I think my best reading of it would be that, we were talking about just earlier, there is no like working class waiting there to inherit the earth, right? There
Right.
is no, if we could just get outside patriarchy and, you know, if we voted for Hillary Clinton, everything will be okay.
Right.
But there's that sense that woman does not exist, right? That's
Yes.
that sense. There's no, like, I was brought up in the era of ecofeminism, and if just have some separatist lesbian collective, everything will be awesome. I think becoming woman is okay. Woman does not exist, right? There is no redemptive outside, but you can either then stay with Lacan and just abandon that, right? Okay, there is no woman, shut the fuck up and just
Right.
deal. Or there's this sense of what would it like becoming woman, what might be generated in that space, right? And there's a recent book, like really recent, Lee Edelman's Bad Education.
You've worked with Edelman before.
Yeah. And he's come back against, well, not against, with like Afro-pessimism that says you can't just include blackness in the polity. You can't just say, you know, black people are just as human as,
Right.
right? No, right. His claim is like, so Afro-pessimism is no, you got to acknowledge that the whole game is built on anti-blackness. And Edelman's come in and said, you can put anything there, woman, trans, queer, blackness. There's
Any other?
Huh?
Any other?
Right. There's always something that is abjected by the public. And his hardcore stance, because of course Lacanian, Demanian, is you have to, like, it does not exist, right? Queerness does not, it's not gay people. Queerness is not gay people, right? If we could just be, all have some gay friends, everything would, you know, it's that there is something inassimilable. And I think becoming woman was a different strategy. Whereas like, yeah, it doesn't exist, that eco-feminist earth mother maternal plenitude thing does not exist, but what could you, like, becoming woman is that, right? It is like what could be pieced together or multiplied outside of the father story, like the Oedipal story,
in the sense in which the event does not exist.
The event does not exist.
It insists, it subsists.
Yeah.
And so it's a language of becoming. It's not a language of being. To bring back your contra your Heideggerian roots, right? You know, it's not something to be uncovered.
Right. And you know, let's go back. Being does not exist, right? Cross it out. You know, it's not something that you can find.
This is wonderful. In fact, I think that to use the Lacanian register, I know you may not have, I don't know, but you may not have gone to see Barbie, by the way.
I don't want to go.
Oh, you have to.
Well, yeah, I think I do. But you know, I tend to wait. I tend to wait until I'm on an airplane to Australia, and then that's like the perfect moment to watch that.
Just download a cam of it, torrent it, you know, in terms of
it has,
you don't have to go to a theater.
Okay, thank you.
But basically, I'll just say, not to kind of ruin or spoil it, but I feel like there is a part of traversing the fantasy of woman, quote unquote, Barbie existing as woman, as, you know, just include her, and you can just take down patriarchy.
Yes,
it's fine. And then we'll get back our Barbie fantasy land. There is a sense in which the movie, for its benefits and its flaws, which I think are few, the flaws at least, I really, really thought it was great. But I do think there is a traversing the fantasy of starting with a kind of commodified Barbie who always stands on her tippy toes, who's you know, this perfect ideal of, you know, women can be everything and are everything. And there is a traversing of the fantasy where that gets toppled, but reinstated, but it's a dialectical reinstatement that's not obviously at the start. So there is a kind of, again, I'm going to abuse the phrase, a traversing of the fantasy of sort of, what if women ruled the world? And it kind of confronts us with that, and with the reality of that inverted image of, let's just say, you know, men rule the world. because Ken has his own traversing of the fantasy. It's very much this question of, and of course, Deleuze and Guattari didn't even coin the phrase of becoming woman, that at least goes back to de Beauvoir, right? Like,
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, she may have coined the phrase, but she probably didn't originate the idea. And of course, ideas are, not
Collective.
necessarily, yeah,
They're
exactly. So,
collective and anonymous. Yeah.
yeah, I'm not trying to make you talk about becoming woman. I'm just trying to think about how so much,
Look at
so
this
much,
guy.
so much,
Oedipus over here.
but so much of the discourse today is still about this idea of woman as being a sort of biological, objective, again, cinema verite,
And yeah,
neutral, given.
why is the New York Times so friggin' obsessed with trans
Mhm.
people, right? Because there has to be this sense that there is woman, right?
There is an essence.
Right? And it just doesn't make sense that to me, that this, like, the whole world is falling apart and we're obsessed about one elite athlete, and and that's because if we don't contain woman with the privatized individual who is or isn't, the whole thing falls down. And it's true, the whole thing does fall down. If you start looking at elite sports, right, which I just had some I don't watch sport, but when I take part in it, like if you go to gravel rides, you can be male, female, or non-binary. Why? Because there's no money involved. But the minute you
Okay.
start going up to like Ironman qualifications, you can't, right? Because the minute you start attributing money, you're privatizing sexuality. And I cannot own a certain body and earn certain money from that body. And that, so I think the whole point about becoming woman would be really radical. If you start with elite sports, right, the whole thing would fall apart, but so would our versions of politics and meritocracy, because we'd like, oh well, at a molar level, yes, we want more women to be CEOs, politicians, blah.
Right.
You're just like, that's bullshit. And the minute you put trans women into that equation, right, everyone starts getting very uncomfortable. What's more interesting is not negotiating with that, looking, why does this make you so uncomfortable? Why is the New York Times so friggin' obsessed with trans kids? Because if we started to look too closely at that, the whole privatization of sexuality would fall apart.
This kind of, and I know this is kind of outside the bounds of this topic, but this makes me rethink the notion of abstract labor power and primitive accumulation, because obviously it's gendered, right? So
Obviously.
how abstract can it be? And I know that Marx and Engels were, for a certain point, like they were fairly, at some points, progressive for their time on this
Yes.
topic. But yeah, that's and I know that you go into this in various ways in your work, so I won't belabor the point. But yeah, I mean, particularly, again, I was talking to a friend, a STEM friend of mine, about the Turing test, and how so often the Turing test gets like boiled down to just proving artificial intelligence ability to, quote unquote, fool a human. But
Yeah.
it's very, I think, purposeful of Turing to have made the AI a female who is a deceiver. It's very clearly a gendered aspect of the test, whereby the AI is a female who is deceiving, and almost like the embodiment of Eve, if you will.
Yes. And then we have Siri and Alexa later.
Oh yeah, I didn't think about that either.
The NPC.
The NPC
goes back
yeah.
to the NPC TikTok kind of vibe too.
Yeah, it's not going to be a male,
men are always subjects.
Right. Again, you're blowing my mind here. Okay, at this point, I know we've had you on for a little while. Coop, I want to let you.
I have one last thing, because you referenced the film The Counselor.
Oh God, I love that film. Yeah,
it's such a great movie, and I'm thinking specifically of the scene whenever he gets the call, or speaks to the Jefe, like the cartel head, which is like just a darkly hilarious moment, but he's the head of the cartel is kind of telling him, I'm like, look, all of these worlds exist. Now you live in the world in which your beloved is dead, and there's nothing you can do to go back and reverse the sequence of events that led to this time. So you need to accept that you're at this particular point where you have to, yeah, you just sort of have to go on. But I think what's also interesting about the whole movie itself in regard to this conversation and a little bit about becoming woman and just the way that this sort of is involved is like this contradiction or this like juxtaposition of Penelope Cruz's character within
Yes.
who is his beloved that sort of represents this typical like stereotypical femininity versus Malkina, who is like the uber woman who like men are sort of nothing to her. Like she fucks the car, like
Yeah.
she's total, like her sexuality is not restrained whatsoever. And she witnesses she talks about how what is it, those leopards chase down their prey and so forth, and she takes like a pleasure in witnessing that and talks about how like the world is going to end and the slaughter to come is.
She's a sort of bad she's the first year undergraduate who's just read Nietzsche, right?
Oh
Who,
my God.
God is dead and now everything is permitted, right? It's that's and hasn't got to the second part of Brothers Karamazov where now, but what are you going to create? Like, what are you going to build? Right? Are you just going to be God is dead, therefore all I'm going to do is be savage, right? Or do you have the maturity or the thought or the sagacity, or can you compose some form of ethics in the absence of God? And if you look at it in McCarthy's sort of weird mythology, if you step outside of America, are you just going to be like a gangland warfare, or could you live without the myth of America? Right. So that's how I read. I mean, McCarthy's more complex than that, right? But there's something profoundly existential about McCarthy, and it's like not God is dead, therefore everything is permitted. It's like it's that active nihilism, right? If it's like
Right, yeah,
God is dead, then what would you be able to compose from that? Because I think it is funny in that film, but also McCarthy's characters, right? Like these gangsters speak like metaphysicians. Part of that is comical, but part of it is there is a certain like philosophical position of gangland, right? Which is how you have like ethics and loyalty in a world without
right, yeah.
the state, right? Or the state, more importantly.
Also kind of interesting in that film how the snuff film, also Penelope Cruz's character, we never see this actual
We assume it's a snuff film.
He gets a disc delivered to his
And
he's hiding out in Mexico and he gets a disc delivered, and which has been already like it's Chekhov's snuff film because it's referenced earlier in the film that
yes,
this is something that happens and so
yes,
forth. So then we automatically know whenever he gets this disc, and he knows too that his beloved has been sort of the victim of this snuff film.
yeah, and that it's unwatchable, right? We
Yeah.
don't watch it.
Which is
And
also kind of the NPC thing too. It's like
it
you're just a
is, right? You
machine.
can imagine, hey, that means that we've got to make a TikTok video
It's
where
like yum yum ice cream.
where Penelope Cruz speaking back. There's a certain always unwatchable component that we know that it's there, right? But we don't want to know what it is. And we know that it's there, but we're certainly not going to watch it, right? And we hope that it's always being mailed to someone else, is the right? And that we're always outsourcing.
Yeah,
Knows about that violence, right? And who has to watch that violence? Well, not us,
right? Yeah, our own disavowal of what the violence that our whole lives are predicated on, basically, is what it amounts to, which you strongly argue.
He's made a mistake, and that's the world he has to watch now.
That's all I had, though.
No, that's great. That's great. Who would we kill to save the world? Which god would we kill, or which world would we kill to save our god? Yeah. Claire, I just want to give you the chance before we let you go to not only plug the book that we kind of roundabout talked about. We kind of like we let the audience maybe get intrigued to get to the center of the book, but let you talk about obviously your most recent work. But if you like, we would also like to hear about what you have forthcoming in the future, if you've
Yeah.
got some projects.
I'm trying to finish a book on the privatization of morality now. So it's going to be
Oh, okay.
forms of moral grandstanding and
Mm-hmm.
tweet storms and partly things about, yes. So that's where I'm going.
What are you going to talk about? Wokeness and the whole
Yes.
war on wokeness?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yep, unfortunately, yes, like cancel, like the woke mob, cancel culture, supposed, there was that Harper's letter that was written by a bunch of luminaries, including the late Martin Amos, I think, maybe.
I don't think I've seen it, and I probably don't want to.
No, but
Talking about
it was classic. Is you can't say anything anymore, right?
Oh,
Was the
right.
motif, right? And so my shtick is, there's no such thing as free speech. Free speech is never free, right? Someone always owns your speech, and you've always bought the right to speech at the expense of something else. So maybe the cinema book, the Who Would You Kill, is about looking, right? And I've moved on, right?
To speaking and
To
hearing.
speaking,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
So that's where I'm at. Yeah.
That's the par lettre, right? To go back to Lacan, you're the speaking being, right?
Yeah.
So from
Lots
the
of
seeing
Lacan.
being to the speaking being. I swear, Coop tweeted something out a few weeks ago about there's this kind of famous picture of Lacan like with Heidegger and his wife, and Heidegger and his wife are looking like almost adoringly at him as though they
Like they're a polycule, honestly. Is what it looks like to
they're
me.
going to that we'll have to maybe I'll send it to you. Maybe I won't bother you with that. You don't have to
I'll have to find it. That's
okay. Yeah, I'm sure Coop, if you want, before we let Claire go, why don't you pull up Lacan with Heidegger? And I think that one of Coop's points was the early Lacan, at least, is very much kind of enamored with Heidegger and
for sure,
and
because it's
you know,
idle chatter, not
mhm,
owning your speech, dead language, being
right.
does not.
There we
Oh
go.
my goodness.
Here we go. So look at Lacan.
Oh my goodness. That's like that meme where the guy is walking along the street and the woman looking at the guy checking out the guy.
Yes.
You have to circulate this now as a meme.
Yes. I'm sorry, but Heidegger's little Hitler mustache is.
I know.
Right.
Why?
Oh, God.
Why?
I'm
Why
sorry, man.
I know.
That's the look that Heidegger, at least
And
Heidegger
Helfrieda,
himself.
yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
they're both kind of. I swear, whenever I see Lacan, I can't, especially younger Lacan, and I know he's middle aged here, but he kind of always reminds me of Anthony Bourdain. Sorry,
Yes.
R.I.P., but I always kind of see
It's a type.
Anthony Bourdain here. But yeah, you can kind of see them. There's something going on here.
Yeah. Like I
this,
say, it's you've got I put it upon you two to circulate this as a meme now.
Yeah.
You know, contemporary feminism, liberal feminism, and Deleuze, like forms of looking.
Did you see Lacan's little wristwatch? That
Wearing
was
the watch over the shirt, yeah.
that was
It's a move.
Yeah,
it's a move, but it's also
a
a very, if I will, that watch, that face of the watch is very feminine position. I mean, he's
women's
on the
time.
yeah, he's exactly. But okay, so you got a book coming out on speaking. Anything else you would like to highlight? Is there a way we can, I know you've been to some conferences lately. Is there a way we can access your most recent talk, or anything we can add in the show notes?
I don't know. I think the last one was the Deleuze conference, and so I'll probably publish that in the next few issues of Deleuze and Guattari Studies.
Okay.
A journal I highly recommend.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
No, that's great. I was talking to Dan about you. Maybe your ears were, again, talking about speaking and hearing. Maybe your ears were burning. I was talking about you about 2 weeks ago, and he was like, "Oh, I'm gonna see her in Europe." So hopefully you got to talk to Dan. He's one of my favorite
Yeah,
people.
gave an absolutely great talk on technics, actually. He
There
did.
you go. That's
Yep.
good. Okay, well, Claire, I want to thank you again for
My pleasure.
for coming and talking with us. Honestly, obviously we had a million more topics opened up with the talk, so definitely I want to thank you again, and hopefully if you had fun today, we can welcome you back once you made more headway in your new book, and we can talk
Yep.
about
Any
speaking
day
next
now.
time.
Out any day. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so
See ya.
much,
ya.
and have a great Sunday.
Okay, thanks. Bye.
Bye.
And once again, thanks to Claire Colebrook for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.